It was November 14th, 1995, a Tuesday that felt less like autumn and more like the sharp, biting edge of a winter that was arriving too early. In the high country of Idaho, near the shadow of the Sawtooth Range, the air didn't just get cold, it turned brittle. It carried the scent of wood smoke from 100 chimneys and the metallic tang of snow waiting in the clouds. For the residents of Pine Creek, a town so small it felt more like a pause in the road than a destination. Life moved at the speed of the seasons. But for 19-year-old Jenna Gable and her 17-year-old sister, Cassidy, the town felt like a cage. Jenna was the protector, the grounded one with the steady job at the local diner and a 1988 Ford Bronco she kept running with duct tape and prayers. Cassidy was the wildfire, bright, restless, and desperate to see the ocean. That night, the sisters sat in the Bronco parked at the edge of Miller's Ridge, overlooking the valley where the lights of their town flickered like dying stars. The heater rattled against the silence, fighting the creeping frost on the glass. Cassidy was talking about Los Angeles again, tracing lines on a map she kept folded in the glove box. Jenna was listening, smiling that tired, affectionate smile she reserved only for her sister. They were listening to a cassette tape, a mix of grunge and acoustic ballads that played softly in the background. It was the kind of night that feels suspended in amber, perfect, quiet, and safe. At 9:45 p.m., they were seen by a truck driver filling up at the jagged edge of town. He reported seeing Jenna laughing as she pumped gas, while Cassidy bought 2 sodas and a pack of red licorice inside. They looked happy. They looked like 2 sisters with secrets, but not the heavy kind. Not yet. They drove out of the station at 9:58 p.m., their taillights dissolving into the heavy mist that rolled off the Snake River. They were supposed to be home by 11 o'clock. Their mother, Martha, had left the porch light on, a beacon cutting through the dark. But 11 o'clock came and went. Then midnight, the porch light kept burning, casting long, hollow shadows across the yard. But the driveway remained empty. The wind picked up, howling through the pines like a choir of mourners. But the familiar rumble of the Bronco's engine never joined the chorus. By morning, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, a soft, white blanket designed to cover the world's imperfections. But it wasn't the snow that chilled Martha Gable to the bone when she walked out to the mailbox at dawn. It was what she found inside. There were no tire tracks in the driveway, no sign that anyone had come or gone. Yet, tucked inside the metal box was a single envelope. No stamp, no postmark, just the name Mom and Dad, scrawled in handwriting that looked familiar, yet strangely jagged. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. "We can't stay here anymore. The town is suffocating us. We're going to California to find the ocean. Don't come looking for us. We'll call when we get settled. Love, Cass and Jenna." Martha stood there, the paper trembling in her hands as the snowflakes melted against the ink, blurring the words. It was the answer the police would later point to. It was the evidence that would close the case before it even opened. But as Martha looked at that note, a terrible, heavy stone settled in her gut. She knew her daughters. She knew Cassidy was impulsive, yes. But Jenna? Jenna wouldn't leave without her contact lenses sitting in the bathroom case. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye to her dog. And she certainly wouldn't leave her paycheck, which was sitting on the kitchen counter, uncashed. The note was a lie. But for the next 30 years, it was a lie that the town, the police, and the world accepted as truth. The investigation, if you could even call it that, hit a wall of silence almost immediately. Sheriff Jim Coulter, a man who had spent 30 years policing broken fences and drunk drivers, took one look at the letter and nodded. "They're runaways, Martha," he said, his voice thick with a sympathy that felt dismissive. "It happens." The younger one talked about California to anyone who'd listen. They packed a bag, dropped the note, and hit the highway. He didn't tape off the house. He didn't dust the mailbox for prints. He didn't send search parties into the woods because, in his mind, the girls weren't lost. They were liberated. But the silence in the Gable house was a living thing. The parents, Martha and Elias, drove the highways themselves. They spent their savings on gas and flyers, taping the smiling faces of Jenna and Cassidy to telephone poles from Boise to Sacramento. They haunted truck stops, showing the photo to weary drivers, begging for a memory, a sighting, a crumb. Have you seen them? Two girls in a red Bronco. The answer was always the same, heads shaking, eyes looking away. Winter settled in hard that year. The snow piled up in drifts that buried fences and froze the river solid. And with the snow came a suffocating quiet. The town of Pine Creek moved on. The missing flyers in the grocery store window began to curl at the corners, yellowing under the fluorescent lights until they were eventually taken down to make room for notices about lost dogs and snowmobile sales. But the woods remembered. Locals started avoiding the old logging road past the reservoir. Hunters claimed the air felt heavier there, that the silence wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that watches you back. Some said they saw tracks that led nowhere. Others claimed that when the wind blew through the canyon, it sounded like a car door slamming shut, over and over again. For Martha and Elias, the passage of time wasn't a river. It was a slow erosion. 10 years passed, then 20. Elias died of a heart attack in 2008, sitting in his armchair by the window, still watching the driveway. Martha kept the porch light on every single night until the bulb burned out. And then she changed it, her hands shaking a little more each year. The case was colder than the Idaho winter. It was frozen solid. The official file on Jenna and Cassidy consisted of 3 pages. The initial report, a copy of the runaway note, and a closure form stamped voluntary departure. But the earth keeps what it takes only for a while. Eventually, the seasons shift. The ground thaws, and the secrets buried in the dark begin to rise. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. But in 2025, the earth finally decided to spit them back out. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, cross-checking facts, verifying records, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. Each episode takes us nearly 15 to 20 days of work. Long nights, quiet hours, and countless moments spent chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and because somewhere out there, someone deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number, it's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. The summer of 2025 brought a heat wave unlike anything Idaho had seen in a century. The snowpack melted too fast, but the rains never came. By August, the state was parched. The forests turned to tinder, and the reservoirs, usually deep and dark with glacial runoff, began to recede. Blackwood Reservoir, a massive man-made lake just 20 miles north of Pine Creek, dropped to historic lows. The water pulled back from the shoreline, revealing rocky mudflats that hadn't seen the sun since the dam was built in the 60s. Stumps of ancient trees rose from the silt like gravestones. On September 12th, a drought watcher named Gary Thorne was walking the newly exposed perimeter, flying a drone to document the water levels for the county. The drone buzzed over a section of the reservoir known as Dead Man's Cove, a steep drop-off usually submerged under 80 feet of water. On his monitor, Gary saw something that made him stop. Jutting out of the drying mud, half-caked in gray silt, was the corner of a roof. It was angular, boxy, too straight to be a rock. He flew the drone lower. The propellers kicked up dust, revealing a rusted luggage rack and a strip of faded red paint. Gary called the sheriff's department. The recovery took 3 days. The mud acted like quicksand, refusing to let go of its prize. Cranes and cables groaned under the strain as the vehicle was slowly, agonizingly pulled from its tomb. When the water finally drained from the cabin and the car settled onto the dry bank, a hush fell over the recovery team. It was a 1988 Ford Bronco. The red paint was oxidized and peeling, but the license plate, preserved by the lack of oxygen in the deep silt, was still legible. For T-892, a deputy ran the number. It came back to a registration that hadn't been renewed in 30 years. Jenna Gable. The news hit Pine Creek like a physical blow. The The Runaways hadn't gone to California. They hadn't gone anywhere. They had been 20 miles from home the entire time, sitting in the dark, cold water while their mother waited by the window. But it was what investigators found inside the car that shattered the Runaway narrative forever. The interior was preserved in a macabre time capsule. The cold water had slowed decomposition, leaving the scene disturbingly intact. In the back seat sat 2 duffel bags, packed, zipped, and ready. But they weren't runaway bags. They contained overnight clothes, curling irons, and a rental movie from Blockbuster that was due back the next day. You don't rent a movie if you're fleeing the state. But the physics of the scene were even more damning. The ignition key was in the off position. The gear shift was in neutral, and the driver's side window was rolled down about 3 inches, just enough for a conversation. If the girls had accidentally driven off the treacherous cliff road above Dead Man's Cove, the car would have been in drive. The key would be on. This car hadn't crashed. It had been pushed. Detective Miller touched the paper. It smeared under his thumb. "He's close," he whispered. "He's on foot." The call went out immediately. A Bolo B on the lookout was issued for Lucas Coulter, the 49-year-old guidance counselor who had spent his life hiding in plain sight. The man who had comforted grieving students, who had organized charity drives, who had stood next to Martha Gable at the grocery store and asked how she was holding up. Canine units were deployed to the edge of the property. The dog, a bloodhound named Sarge, caught a scent almost immediately. It didn't lead toward the highway. It didn't lead toward the train tracks. It led into the woods. The search team moved in a phalanx line, flashlights cutting through the dense pine forest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 30 years ago, this same town had refused to search these woods for Jenna and Cassidy. Now, they were tearing the forest apart to find the man who helped bury them. They tracked him for 3 miles, up the steep incline of Miller's Ridge. The terrain was unforgiving, loose shale and thorny underbrush that clawed at the officers' uniforms. 2 a.m., they found him. Lucas wasn't running. He was sitting on a fallen log at the very edge of the overlook, the exact spot where Jenna and Cassidy had parked to watch the lights 30 years ago. He was staring down into the darkness of the valley. In his hand, he held the matching cassette tape to the one found in the Bronco. When the officers raised their weapons, shouting for him to show his hands, Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He just pressed play on the small handheld recorder in his lap. The voice that echoed through the quiet forest wasn't his. It was his father's voice, younger, stronger, from 1995. "You do this for me, Luke. You do this or I go to prison. And if I go, you go. You pushed that car. You're part of it now." Lucas looked up at the officers, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "I was 17, he said, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to make him proud." He was arrested without incident. In the interrogation room, the nice neighbor facade crumbled. Lucas confessed to everything. He described how his father, the sheriff, had panicked after Jenna threatened to report him for harassment during the traffic stop. He described how his father had forced him to help push the neutral-geared Bronco over the edge of the cove. He described the sickening splash it made as it hit the water, and the 30 years of silence he had bought with his soul. Martha Gable was there for the sentencing. She didn't speak. She didn't yell. She simply looked at Lucas Coulter, the boy who had grown up in her town, the man who had waved at her for decades. And she stood up. She walked out of the courtroom, into the bright Idaho sunshine, and for the first time in 30 years, she took a full breath. The woods of Pine Creek are quiet now. The reservoir has risen back up, covering the scar where the Bronco had laid. But locals say the town feels different, lighter. The earth had kept the secret for a generation, waiting for the water to recede, waiting for the ink to fade, waiting for the truth to rise. And finally, the wait was over.